Welcome to WW2 Rewired, a cinematic journey through the untold human side of World War II. Here we go beyond the battles, beyond the tanks, the generals, the headlines. We uncover the moments when humanity flickered, in the trenches, in the hospitals, in the hearts of those who fought and those who simply endured. Every episode rewires how we see the war, not as history written by victors, but as truth witnessed by survivors. Real documents, real voices, real history brought to life. Subscribe and step into the stories that changed the world. One act of courage, one act of mercy at a time. This is WW2 Rewired, where history breathes again. April 1945, Western Germany. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Convoys of captured women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, trudged through the mud toward a makeshift American processing camp near Remagen. Their uniforms, once pressed and proud, were now stiff with dirt and defeat. Silence clung to them more tightly than their coats. The air smelled of smoke and wet hay. In the distance, a generator hummed, the sound of order returning after chaos. American soldiers, standing guard with rifles slung low, watched the prisoners file in. There were no shouts, no whips, no barking dogs. Only the quiet efficiency of soldiers tired of war. Then came the moment they didn't expect. A young American sergeant, his boots splattered with mud, handed out bars of soap and clean towels. The women hesitated. Some stared unblinking, believing it was a trick. For years they had been told Americans were savages, men who would strip them of dignity. But here they stood, bewildered, holding fragments of decency in their trembling hands. For the first time in months, a few dared to breathe, not as soldiers, but as human beings again, and it all began with something as simple as soap and a towel. By 1944, the tide of the Second World War had turned. In the east, the Red Army surged across Poland, closing on Berlin. In the west, American and British forces had landed in France, breaking through German lines after Normandy. The air was filled with the thunder of bombers, the roads choked with refugees, and the world itself seemed to be running out of breath. Among the collapsing fronts, a lesser-known reality unfolded, the capture of thousands of female personnel from the Axis powers. They were not frontline soldiers, but their service bound them to the machinery of war. German Helferinnen, communication operators, nurses, secretaries of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, were captured alongside their male comrades. In the Pacific, Japanese nurses, clerks, and Red Cross workers fell into Allied hands as the islands fell one by one. For most of these women, surrender did not bring safety. They had been raised under regimes that fed them myths of the enemy's cruelty. In Nazi Germany, propaganda films warned that the American will not take prisoners. In Japan, government broadcasts painted Allied troops as beasts who mutilated captives. Fear was their final weapon, and it stayed loaded even after their rifles were gone. When the first female prisoners arrived at American-controlled camps in Europe and the Pacific, their faces told the same story, disbelief wrapped in terror. Many had prepared to die rather than face capture. Some carried cyanide pills, others tore insignias from their uniforms in shame. The war had not only taken their nations, it had taken the ground beneath what they believed about civilization itself. The United States Army, however, operated differently. Unlike the Eastern Front, where vengeance ruled, the Western Allies followed structured military conduct influenced by the 1929 Geneva Convention. It mandated that prisoners of war, regardless of rank or gender, were to be protected from violence, intimidation, and public curiosity. They were to receive food, medical care, and respect for their personal dignity. Yet in 1945, ideals met reality on muddy German soil. American camps had been hastily constructed. Tents, barbed wire, and open fields converted into holding zones. The U.S. Army was managing nearly 5 million prisoners across Europe by the end of the war. Resources were stretched thin. Water, rations, and sanitation were strained. Still, amidst logistical chaos, field officers made one unspoken rule. Decency must not collapse with victory, so they enforced routines. Washing stations, medical inspections, and simple hygiene distributions. Soap and towels were rationed like ammunition. Cleanliness was more than comfort. It was a matter of discipline and disease control. But for the women arriving from the ruins of the Reich, it meant something else entirely. a gesture of respect they thought impossible. The American guards, many barely older than the women they processed, didn't know they were reshaping perceptions born of years of propaganda. To them, it was standard procedure. To the prisoners, it was civilization reintroduced by the hands of their former enemies. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, similar moments occurred on islands like Leyte and Okinawa. Japanese women, captured after months of siege, were treated according to the same American protocols. They were deloused, fed, and offered the same hygiene kits as male POWs. Some broke down in tears. A few refused the items at first, believing the soap was poisoned. Allied medics had to demonstrate its harmlessness by washing their own hands in front of them. These scenes were small, almost invisible in the chaos of the war's end, yet they marked something profound. The women were not spared captivity, but they were spared humiliation. That was the difference between defeat and degradation. And as spring 1945 unfolded, across Europe and the Pacific, the world began to witness the first fragile signs of moral reconstruction, one that started not in parliaments or treaties, but in the silent exchange between guard and prisoner, soap and towel. As the Allied advance tore through the final months of the war, the Western Front transformed from a battlefield into a vast human holding zone. Germany, stripped of command and coherence, became a patchwork of surrendering divisions, scattered civilians, and abandoned outposts. In this collapsing world, American and British forces inherited an impossible responsibility: to manage millions of prisoners while maintaining the very ideals they had fought to defend. The structure of American prisoner of war administration was remarkable in its efficiency. Each camp was organized under the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's Office, which issued detailed manuals outlining how POWs, including women, were to be processed. From the moment of capture, identities were logged, medical examinations conducted, and hygiene enforced. The distribution of soap and towels was not merely about comfort. It was a standardized act of control and decency, meant to restore order in the aftermath of chaos. The camps themselves ranged from massive compounds like Rheinberg and Remagen in Germany to smaller facilities across France and Belgium. Each site was fenced with barbed wire, but inside the environment often resembled a disciplined village rather than a dungeon. POWs worked in kitchens, gardens, and repair sheds under supervision. Those with medical or clerical experience, especially the captured German and Japanese women, were often assigned to assist Allied doctors, nurses, or translators. It was here that the human contradiction of war appeared most clearly. The same hands that had served totalitarian regimes now tended to the wounded of democracy. The same women who once believed Allied soldiers were monsters now saw them cleaning wounds and rationing bread. American camp officers had been instructed to prevent cruelty and to enforce hygiene as a matter of military honor. Diseases like typhus and dysentery were spreading across post-war Europe. Soap and sanitation were as critical as bullets once had been. The prisoners were given delousing powder, clean undergarments when available, and rations standardized according to Geneva guidelines. The response from many of the women was disbelief, not gratitude at first, but stunned silence. They had entered captivity expecting degradation. Instead, they were treated as people. Reports from the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division later noted that female prisoners, especially Germans, often broke down upon realizing that Allied men followed strict codes of discipline even toward their captives. For Japanese women, the shock was even greater. Raised in an environment that equated capture with eternal shame, they experienced a profound cultural collapse upon encountering American conduct. Some could not reconcile kindness with defeat. Others began to write about it secretly in diaries that would surface decades later. Small, fragile accounts of the moment they realized their enemies did not behave like demons. In both theaters, the same simple ritual repeated: arrival, registration, delousing, and the issuing of soap and towels. It was unremarkable to the guards, but unforgettable to those receiving them. In that act, the women glimpsed something their regimes had erased: the idea that even in victory, the enemy could choose mercy over vengeance. Across the camps, Red Cross observers documented these conditions carefully. Their reports described cleanliness maintained with military precision and discipline enforced without brutality. Such descriptions would later become crucial in post-war tribunals. when the Allies contrasted their treatment of prisoners with the atrocities uncovered in Axis camps. For the women, the moral reversal was difficult to process. They had believed they were fighting for the civilized world against barbarism. Now they stood in line under Allied command, being handed tools of cleanliness, not chains. This quiet moment, soap, towel, running water, was not a ceremony but a revelation. It marked the threshold between the world that had burned and the one beginning to rebuild itself. And it is from this fragile balance between defeat and dignity that the deeper story unfolds, the story of human angles, fear, and unexpected decency inside the prison camps of a collapsing world. The moment of surrender was not the end of fear. For many captured women, it was the beginning of a deeper uncertainty, a silence filled with the weight of propaganda, memory, and shame. They were trained to believe that captivity meant dishonor, that surrender erased identity. Yet as they entered the order of American camps, reality began to erode the illusions that had shaped their world. The human angle. The faces that entered those camps were not warriors, but human remnants of a dying regime. German Helferinnen, clerks of the Luftwaffe, and field nurses had lived months in collapsing cities, surviving bombings, shortages, and retreat. When captured, most were malnourished, covered in lice, their nerves frayed from the collapse of everything they had served. American medics recorded their conditions in precise, detached language, undernourished, fatigued, compliant. Yet behind those sterile words lay something profoundly human: relief. Relief that the shooting had stopped, that the men with rifles were not executioners. There was no triumph in their surrender, only exhaustion. For some, captivity meant safety for the first time in years. The quiet rules of the camp, meals at fixed hours, the discipline of cleaning, the shared silence before lights out, became the first rhythm of peace they had known since 1939, the moral angle. The moral contrast was staggering. American soldiers, many of whom had seen concentration camps with their own eyes, were now commanded to treat German and Japanese prisoners with strict adherence to Geneva. They followed this not only out of law, but out of conviction that civilization must be measured by restraint, not revenge. For the guards, many in their 20s, the task was not simple. Some had lost brothers or friends to the enemy these women had served. But the U.S. Army's ethos was clear. Cruelty was the enemy's language, not theirs. Camp commanders often reminded their men that discipline includes decency. In the Pacific, the moral test was even sharper. After the brutal battles of Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, emotions ran deep. Yet when Japanese women surrendered, American medics and nurses treated their wounds, fed them, and administered the same hygiene kits distributed in Europe. Soap became a moral instrument, proof that the victors would not imitate the vanquished. The cultural angle for Axis women, the cultural shock was profound. Propaganda had painted Americans as brutes, men without honor, women without virtue. But the sight of American women in uniform overturned everything they believed. In German ideology, a woman's place was in service to the state and motherhood. In Japanese society, obedience and purity were the ultimate virtues. Now inside Allied camps, they saw women driving trucks, inspecting barracks, commanding medical units. They spoke freely to men, worked side by side, and were saluted by enlisted soldiers. To the prisoners, this vision was more disorienting than the defeat itself. Letters and diaries recovered after the war described the shock of seeing women act without fear. A German radio operator wrote, "They laughed with the soldiers. They commanded men. We had never seen such a thing. It was like another world, one that had not lost itself to orders and salute." That moment, the handing of soap and towels, symbolized more than hygiene. It was cultural collapse and rebirth colliding in one gesture. It said, "You are clean now. You are human. You are not what they told you to be." Across both Europe and the Pacific, this revelation broke through the iron narratives of enemy hatred. The women realized that their captors followed not instinct but principle, and for many that quiet decency struck deeper than any sermon or surrender document could. The shock of kindness was not a single moment. It became a mirror, reflecting the moral boundaries of war itself. But to understand how deeply this moment changed both sides, we must look beyond emotion, into the psychological and medical dimensions that made this exchange more than mercy. It was the restoration of dignity. The psychological angle captivity begins in the body, but it ends in the mind. For the women prisoners of 1945, the first act of washing, of touching clean water again, was a moment of psychological collapse. Years of conditioning dissolved under something as ordinary as warmth and soap. American psychiatrists attached to the European theater of operations later documented this reaction. They noted how female POWs often displayed anxious compliance during intake, followed by visible emotional release after basic hygiene was restored. In plain words, they wept. Some cried while scrubbing their hands, others while combing their hair for the first time in months. The act of washing became an act of recovery, a ritual that said, "I am still a person." For the guards and nurses who witnessed it, these moments were quietly haunting. They saw that the real destruction of war wasn't only physical, it was moral and psychological. These women had been trained to believe that the enemy was a beast. Yet in that hour, it was the so-called beast who returned their humanity to them. The irony was profound. The conqueror restored what propaganda had taken away. To the U.S. Army Medical Corps, cleanliness was strategy. The field manuals were explicit. No hygiene, no order. No order, no control. Every camp followed a triage system: medical inspection, delousing, bathing, and the issue of clean towels and soap. Lice and typhus were seen as enemies as deadly as the Wehrmacht itself, but the clinical became deeply symbolic. American doctors and nurses, some of them women, treated enemy patients with professional precision. They disinfected wounds, distributed sulfa drugs, and even instructed German and Japanese nurses to assist in procedures. For those prisoners, it was an inversion of everything they had been taught: that the victor should humiliate, not collaborate. One American medic wrote in his journal, "They stared at the soap in their hands as if it were gold. You could see disbelief more than gratitude." In many camps, medical care was also a silent exchange of trust. Prisoners who once feared poison now handed their arms for injections. Doctors who had seen horrors in Buchenwald or Manila swore quietly to themselves that these camps would be different, that here, medicine would not serve ideology, only healing. The soap and towel became part of that moral medicine. It wasn't luxury. It was proof that decency could still survive amidst rubble. Within weeks, camp life developed its own fragile society. The women who had arrived in terror began to organize, cleaning barracks, tending gardens, teaching each other languages. American administrators encouraged this order. Structure was sanity. They allowed supervised correspondence, reading, and even small cultural events in some camps. In that strange mixture of captivity and community, new roles emerged. Some of the German women, formerly propaganda staff or communication operators, began translating for U.S. officers. Japanese nurses worked alongside American medical personnel in basic care units. What began as compliance became cooperation, and eventually quiet respect. The camps became laboratories of reconciliation, accidental ones. Sociologists studying POW behavior after the war noted that female captives often adapted more quickly than male counterparts. They were less driven by ideology, more by survival and communication. They valued routine, small freedoms, and the restoration of dignity. The simple gesture of hygiene had started this process. It is here that history's smallest act revealed its largest meaning. When an American soldier handed a woman prisoner a bar of soap and a towel, it wasn't just an exchange of objects. It was the unspoken recognition that war had limits, and humanity could still be defended. The gesture echoed through testimonies for decades. Some former POWs interviewed in the 1960s and 1970s recalled that first night as the moment their fear of the world began to fade. Others could not explain why the memory stayed vivid, perhaps because in that instant they saw what civilization looked like when it refused to break. By late 1945, these lessons would quietly shape policy, diplomacy, and the moral tone of the post-war world. But before that transformation, one event would mark the emotional turning point. A single day inside a processing camp where everything changed. The moment when captors and captives finally saw each other not as enemies, but as human beings. April 1945, Remagen Processing Camp, Western Germany. The war in Europe was in its final gasp. The bridgeheads across the Rhine had been secured, the thunder of artillery now replaced by the constant rumble of convoys carrying prisoners, thousands at a time. Among them came the women of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, their ranks scattered by the collapse of the Reich. They arrived in silence, guarded by young American MPs who looked more like weary farm boys than conquerors. The women carried nothing but their identification papers and the dust of retreat on their faces. The air was cold, the camp muddy but organized. Lines of tents stretched along the riverbank, framed by barbed wire and wooden signposts marked U.S. Army Temporary Detention Area, 13B. The registration table stood beneath a canvas awning. A corporal called names. One by one the prisoners stepped forward, their accents clipped, their eyes fixed on the ground. Behind the table sat a medical sergeant and a female Red Cross volunteer. An American nurse named Ellen Brooks, 23 years old, sent from New York to assist in field processing. It was Ellen who began the small act that history would remember. As each woman completed her paperwork, she handed them a small brown packet, a towel, a bar of soap, and a small tin of antiseptic powder. Nothing more. But to those women the gesture felt impossible. They hesitated, uncertain whether to accept it. The rumors that had followed them through retreat, stories of Allied vengeance, of humiliation, were not fading easily. One German nurse whispered to another, "They're making fun of us." Another asked in halting English if she was expected to pay for the soap. Ellen shook her head and said quietly, "For you. Everyone gets one." The tone was neither pitying nor proud. It was procedural, routine, but to those who had lived in terror, routine itself felt miraculous. When the first group was led to the bathing tent, the moment turned surreal. For months they had washed in streams or wiped their hands with rags. Now warm water flowed from metal barrels heated over stoves. There was laughter from American soldiers struggling with leaky hoses. It was absurdly human. The prisoners stood barefoot on the cold floor, steam curling around their faces, and began to wash. No music played. No speeches were made. Yet something invisible changed. A young signal operator named Hildegard wrote later in her diary, "It was strange. They did not hate us. We did not understand." That night in the barracks, the camp interpreter, a German-American sergeant named Louis Kramer, translated the camp's first announcement: meals at 6, roll call at 8, lights out by 10. The prisoners were to be treated according to the laws of war. There would be no punishments without cause. They were free to write home when permitted. Many didn't believe it. One woman asked, "Is this temporary before interrogation?" Another whispered, "When will the soldiers come?" But nothing happened. The lights went out. The guards rotated shifts. Outside, the Rhine kept flowing, black and silent under the rain. The next morning, the smell of coffee drifted through the camp. It was the first American morning they had ever known, one without fear. A group of women lined up at the water pump, scrubbing their hands, exchanging fragments of broken English and laughter with an American cook, who pretended to be offended that they didn't like powdered eggs. It was all small, ordinary, forgettable, and yet for them unforgettable. By noon, Red Cross observers arrived and noted in their report, female prisoners appear calm, cooperative, conditions humane, hygiene measures adequate, no evidence of maltreatment. The U.S. Army saw it as another day's work, but for those inside the wire, it was the day the world's sharp edges began to soften. The war had taught them to fear uniforms. Now uniforms brought structure and predictability. The enemy had become the protector. And beneath the thin roofs of those tents, women who had once typed orders for destruction now sat quietly, holding towels that smelled faintly of soap, the scent of order after an age of chaos. But history never changes in a single gesture. The true turning point came days later, when the walls of fear finally gave way, when captors and captives began to speak, work, and even share fragments of ordinary life together inside the barbed wire of peace. The following days unfolded not with tension, but with quiet disbelief. For the first time since their capture, the women began to speak in full sentences, at first only to each other, then cautiously to the guards. In Camp 13B, one could hear a strange blend of languages, English commands, German murmurs, laughter echoing faintly across the gravel paths. The camp's internal rhythm had shifted. The air no longer carried the scent of fear, but of damp clothes drying on ropes, of stew simmering in the field kitchen. It was here that the great contradiction of the war revealed itself. The enemy had become the teacher. American women, nurses, clerks, and Red Cross volunteers began teaching the German prisoners how to maintain camp sanitation, how to ration soap, how to boil water properly. They didn't do it out of charity, but out of order. Yet to the women prisoners it was a lesson in something far larger. The American nurse Ellen Brooks, whose quiet professionalism had first disarmed suspicion, recalled in an interview years later, "They were terrified of us. You could see it in their eyes. The soap and towel were the first things that made them look up, not with fear but with confusion. That confusion soon turned into recognition." The German and Japanese women realized that these American soldiers and nurses lived by a different code, one that allowed both power and compassion to coexist. They weren't weak. They weren't pretending. They simply believed that civilization survived only if it refused to act like the enemy it had defeated. Inside the camp infirmary, small partnerships began to form. Captured German nurses assisted American medics with wounded soldiers, both German and Allied. They bandaged wounds, recorded supplies, and sterilized instruments side by side. It was a paradox too profound for words, the vanquished helping the victors heal. For the Americans, it was practical cooperation. For the prisoners, it was a slow rebirth of self-worth. A German Red Cross nurse named Annalisa later wrote in her statement to the International Red Cross, "They gave us back our work, not as enemies, but as women who could still serve life." Meanwhile, in the Pacific, similar scenes unfolded at the Lady POW facilities. Japanese women, broken by exhaustion, began assisting in cleaning and nursing duties under Allied supervision. Some refused at first, claiming it was dishonorable to serve the enemy. But when American officers explained that it was voluntary, not forced labor, something shifted. They realized their captors were not interested in humiliation, only hygiene and order. There were still lines that could not be crossed. The prisoners were never free. Barbed wire still surrounded them. Guards still carried rifles. But within those boundaries, humanity began to breathe again. One afternoon, a sudden downpour flooded the perimeter ditches. The American guards scrambled to divert the water, while the German prisoners, unasked, ran out with buckets and shovels to help. It lasted only 20 minutes, but in that brief teamwork, something unspoken passed between them. The kind of understanding that war had tried, and failed, to destroy. Afterward, a guard shared cigarettes through the fence. A nurse passed around chocolate rations. And then came the sound that no one expected to hear: laughter. It wasn't loud, just a ripple through the camp air, but it marked the first moment that both sides forgot. If only for seconds, who had won and who had lost. The soap and towel had opened the door. The shared labor and decency had carried them through it. For American officers, this transformation was both remarkable and strategic. Psychological warfare experts realized that humane treatment produced cooperation far more effectively than fear. They reported that morale within camps improved, discipline strengthened, and incidents of resistance dropped dramatically. The American model of prisoner conduct, rooted in structure, sanitation, and respect, was proving its worth not only morally but operationally. But beneath statistics and policy, the human story remained simple. The same women who had once believed the enemy was inhuman now wrote letters home describing them as strangely kind or clean and correct. For them, captivity became not an erasure, but a revelation. In a letter preserved in post-war archives, a German auxiliary wrote, "When they gave us soap, I thought it was to mock us. But when they gave it to everyone, I realized we had been lied to all along." By the end of April 1945, the war in Europe was ending, but inside the wire, something timeless had occurred. An empire had fallen, but civility had not, and as the camp lights dimmed each night, the sound of quiet breathing filled the barracks, prisoners and guards separated by rules, yet bound by the smallest proof that humanity still had rules worth keeping. The battles were over, but their consequences had only begun. Now, as the guns fell silent across continents, the world faced the aftermath, the reckoning of conscience and memory that would define what victory truly meant. When the war finally ended in May 1945, The world's attention turned to the ruin, the cities in ash, the millions displaced, and the graves without names. But amid that devastation, the Allied prisoner of war camps stood as testaments to another kind of reconstruction. One that began not with concrete, but with conscience. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office compiled thousands of pages of reports detailing the conditions inside its European and Pacific POW camps. Among them were summaries of the female enclosures, small sections within larger compounds reserved for women. The tone of the documents was bureaucratic, unemotional, yet their implications were profound. Treatment humane and consistent, one report stated. Sanitation adequate, cooperation satisfactory. In the sterile language of military paperwork lay the outline of a quiet moral victory. The Red Cross confirmed these findings through inspections across Germany, France, and the Philippines. Their observers noted that American facilities consistently provided clean water, bathing access, medical care, and ration parity for both male and female captives. It was not perfect, supplies were often short, and overcrowding was frequent, but the essential principle held: dignity, even for the defeated. For the captured women, that dignity became a slow awakening. The diaries and testimonies collected after their release reveal the same pattern: shock, disbelief, then reluctant respect. One German Helferin wrote, "I was prepared for punishment. Instead, they gave me a blanket and told me to sleep." Another entry from a Japanese nurse taken prisoner in the Philippines reads, "They washed us. They gave us food. We were ashamed, not because we were hungry, but because they treated us better than we were told to treat our enemies." The moral contrast did not go unnoticed. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied investigators uncovered the full scale of Nazi concentration camps: Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The horror that emerged from those gates made the discipline of the American POW system even more significant. While Axis captives received food, hygiene, and medical care, millions of civilians and prisoners under Nazi or Imperial Japanese control had perished in starvation and brutality. The juxtaposition was staggering. The victors had chosen to act by law, even toward those who had broken every law of humanity. For the American officers overseeing the camps, this was not idealism. It was identity. Colonel Albert R. Paddock, who supervised several European facilities, wrote, "If we abandon our code now, victory is meaningless. The measure of civilization is not what it destroys, but what it preserves." By the autumn of 1945, female POWs began to be transferred or repatriated under Allied supervision. Some were interrogated for intelligence, others cleared for release. But across all records, one detail repeats: the moment of first contact, issued soap and towel. To military historians, it was procedural. To the prisoners, it became symbolic. The dividing line between myth and reality, between indoctrination and humanity. The reports that circulated through Allied command did not glorify these acts. They simply noted compliance with international convention. Yet, in retrospect, those mundane records tell a larger story. That even in the last shadows of war, discipline and decency had endured. But the story did not end with release. The women who returned home to Germany or Japan carried with them a silence, a complicated truth about the enemy they had feared. That silence, and the way it shaped post-war memory, would become the final layer of this history. When repatriation began in late 1945, it moved quietly, ships crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, trains leaving depots filled with former captives heading back to broken nations. Among those passengers were the women POWs, German auxiliaries, Japanese nurses, communication clerks. They returned to countries that barely recognized them. In Germany, the Third Reich was gone, its leaders imprisoned or executed. Cities lay in ruins, and the people lived in moral collapse as much as material destruction. The returning women spoke little of their captivity. Most feared being seen as collaborators or traitors. In a society consumed by hunger and rebuilding, no one asked. Their stories, of soap, towels, and quiet decency, did not fit the narrative of defeat or guilt. In Japan, the silence was even heavier. Captured women, even those who had served in medical roles, often faced deep shame. The imperial code considered capture a lifelong dishonor. Many erased their experience entirely. burning letters or hiding diaries. Yet hidden in attics and archives decades later, those same diaries would tell the story of disbelief, not at brutality, but at kindness. One Japanese nurse's surviving journal reads, "The enemy did not punish us. They cleaned us." We did not understand what kind of victory this was. The paradox lingered for decades. For the Allied world, these acts of restraint became part of a larger legacy. At the Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes tribunals, the Allies presented evidence of atrocities committed by Axis powers: starvation, forced labor, executions. In contrast, when the treatment of Axis prisoners by the Allies was reviewed, the record stood largely unblemished. The U.S. Army's adherence to Geneva principles became a benchmark for future military ethics, influencing post-war policies, including those of the newly formed United Nations and the revised Geneva Convention of 1949. But the meaning of those small gestures, the soap, the toweling, lived not in documents but in memories. For some former POWs, it became the moment that destroyed their illusions about racial and cultural superiority. For others, it was a moral wound, realizing that the enemy had shown more decency than their own leaders. By the 1960s, historians and sociologists began interviewing surviving prisoners. One American scholar, Dr. Elizabeth Ryan, recorded a conversation with a former Luftwaffe operator who had been captured at Remagen. "They told us Americans were animals. But the first American I met gave me soap and said, 'It's over now.' That was the day I stopped believing in everything I'd been taught." Across the Pacific, U.S. Army archives in Manila preserved statements from Japanese prisoners, many written in halting English. A nurse's note simply read, "We feared torture. We found discipline. We were enemies, but they were correct." These fragments, gathered over years, became the quiet testimony of civilization's endurance. Even decades later, the symbolism endured in military training manuals, humanitarian law, and Red Cross briefings. The insistence that victory without compassion breeds only another war. The women POWs had become unintended witnesses to that truth. In the great scale of the Second World War, a conflict of 70 million dead, the handing of soap and towels might seem trivial. But in that small act lived the very essence of what the Allies claimed to fight for. A world ruled by law, not vengeance, and though few spoke of it, those women carried home not just memories of surrender, but proof that humanity had survived its darkest century. The noise of war had ended, but history's deeper echo remained. A question whispered through every camp, every ruined city, every survivor's silence. If mercy can exist in victory, what then is the real measure of power? In every war there are moments that escape the sound of gunfire, moments so small that history almost forgets them. Yet those are often the ones that define what humanity becomes afterward. The story of the women POWs and the soap and towels is one such moment. No battles were fought that day. No medals were earned. But a principle was proven: that civilization is measured not by the enemies it destroys, but by the dignity it restores. The soldiers who handed out those supplies did not see themselves as heroes. To them it was routine, part of the paperwork, part of the protocol. But to the prisoners it was an awakening. It shattered years of lies, replaced hatred with confusion, and confusion with respect. In a war built on dehumanization, this single gesture reaffirmed the meaning of being human. History tends to remember the roar, the invasions, the victories, the surrender ceremonies. It rarely remembers the silence that follows, the quiet acts of rebuilding, the moments when decency holds its ground amid ruins. Yet it is in those silences that the true nature of nations is written. The soap and towel were not weapons, yet they defeated something that bombs could not: the myth of the enemy as monster. They reminded the world that even in conquest, restraint is power, that mercy is not weakness and it is discipline. In the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt and Asia began to heal, those who had lived through that moment carried with them an invisible proof that the ideals of humanity, though buried in rubble, could be found again in the simplest of gestures. The war had ended in violence, but civilization was reborn in quiet hands, passing out soap and towels under a gray German sky.